you want to equip all police officers in the United States with body cameras. Now, there's 18,000, give or take, law enforcement agencies at the federal, state, and local level. There are many police unions. There's a lot of autonomy at the local level.
Yes.
How would you execute that? How would you get every police officer in the U.S. wearing a body camera?
Well, you're right that there are many, many local agencies. And it's not necessarily the case that even as president, I could say every police officer in every agency is going to have a body camera. But what you can do at the federal level is you can say it is funded fully. And we're not talking about that mammoth an amount of money. We're talking about maybe several $billions would be enough to buy a camera for every police officer in the country. And then if you're a police department, you're literally like, well, the feds have funded this. And so we don't like the idea of cameras so much that we're going to turn down free cameras for our officers. That's going to be a very hard argument for municipal departments to make. And then if you're a citizen of that town, you're like, wait a minute, they're like literally free cameras that you guys are turning down? Like, what are you guys doing over there? So you could get significant adoption around the country if you just foot the bill. And from a public standpoint, I think we'd all accept what's a relatively trivial cost in the context of our budget to know that there's a new standard being offered for police officers around the country, which is that we expect their interactions with us to be recorded. And then if that's the new norm, then any interaction that's not recorded, then we'd look at it and say, well, what happened there? And then it becomes more and more of a standard for police officers to adopt over time.
It's such a rough reality that we know Black people in particular face in terms of police brutality and violence. If it were my son, I would say, look, son, you have to give them absolutely no reason to do something. Just survive so you can come home and tell me about it. Do nothing that is going to seem the least bit, cause for alarm. And even if they mistreat you, even if they are clearly unjust or out to get you, just take it, and just come home so I can see you again.
There are many people who feel that policing as we know it is unsustainable and that it needs to be abolished and replaced with a different type of enforcement. What is your response to that?
Well, I think that's insightful in the sense that community-based policing would be much, much more effective in many, many situations, and trying to demilitarize police departments. It's like a lot of these police departments have essentially military hardware. And then so if you have military hardware and you don't really know the people you're policing, then you wind up with this very, very naturally mistrustful dynamic.
Would you cut off any type of program federally that would give police officers military equipment?
Yes, I would. I do not think that police departments need military equipment in 98% of situations, and that if they do need it, then there are other units that can assist with that. I mean, that's why these other units exist.
An out-of-the-box suggestion that someone here in Iowa made that I actually love. I'm going to try it out on you. We'll see if you like it. He said that we should train every police officer in Jiu Jitzu, which is an art where you essentially can just wrap someone up and then subdue them. And I love that suggestion so much, because if a police officer knew that they could actually just subdue you hand to hand, then the odds of them escalating the lethal force would go much, much down, because it's I feel more confident I can actually. So that's the kind of thing that would actually make us safer. So I would say, hey, any police officer that wants this kind of martial arts training, we should they do that. But I actually think ramping it up to a higher degree where you almost have a disposition where a police officer should be able to resolve a lot of situations without resorting to taking out their firearm.
Andrew, part of why we were so interested in your campaign, and I think why you captured the imagination and attention of so many people, is because you really understood how, even before the pandemic, while the top line economic numbers were looking good, that there were a lot of people who were struggling, whose backs were against the wall, and that was a fundamentally unsustainable situation. Now we see through the spark of police brutality and violence, not just in Minnesota, but what we saw in terms of racist violence with Ahmaud Arbery, what we saw with police violence with Breonna Taylor as well. We see this conflagration across the country. Just talk to us about what you see is going on, what are the important dynamics at play, and what the path forward looks to be for you.
I mean, I'm like every other American, where it's horrifying and heartbreaking what happened to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And this response is born, as you're suggesting, Crystal, of the fact that millions of Americans do not feel like our leaders have been responsive to them and their needs. The fact that economic despair is now rampant in this country and the pandemic has made it much worse. So we're unfortunately in a state where a spark can light fire in terms of protests and people feeling like their voices will not be heard unless they come together on the streets. And I wish it had not gotten to this point. Certainly, the officer who killed George Floyd should be arrested immediately, well before anyone else gets arrested for, let's say, for example, my CNN colleague who was reporting on the aftermath in Minneapolis. The fact that he got arrested before the officer is exactly what's frustrating so many people.
You know, I woke up today and I felt like the world is basically like just falling apart, right? And it feels like we're approaching some pretty dystopian times. And I just wanted to know, if you were president right now, you know, what steps would you take immediately to try and heal this country in light of the riots and everything and George Floyd's death?
If I were president, I would be in Minneapolis and I would make sure that the officer in question was arrested immediately, and an inquiry into the fact that the other officers were also there bystanding. You know, like that should be investigated too. And the officer, certainly the officer who took George Floyd's life directly should be in jail immediately. And then I would talk to the people there and say, we understand how there's nothing we can do to bring George Floyd back, but we have to do everything we can to make this right for you, for your community, and we have to make sure this never happens again. That's a very tall order right now because the mistrust and the anger and the pain is just so deep and long standing. I mean, like George Floyd is just the latest in this whole series of victims of violence in the Black community from law enforcement. And so it's unclear whether people in Minneapolis would even listen to like appeals to heart and reason. But it starts with some measure of justice. And it cannot be that the officers in question are still like roaming free.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think like everyone's saying that this is kind of like just the tip of the iceberg. Like you just see it because it was recorded, but this happens all the time. Like, how do you even, is it even possible to legislate away systemic racism? Like, how do you even begin to do that? Like what are the bigger issues that we need to be dealing with in order to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen? Like, what can we control, you know?
Exactly. What can we control? And so there are a lot of things we can control. So the most obvious one is that George Floyd was killed for, I believe it was like a counterfeit bill or check or something like that. That if you have less poverty in communities, then people will be victimized less often by law enforcement for crimes that are born of deprivation. That's something we can control. We can control how police officers are trained and what the standards are. One of the things that I found most horrifying when I dug into this set of issues, Padget, it's like I'm a data guy. So you're like, okay, how many victims of violence are there? How many citizens get shot by police officers every year? We don't know because that data is not reported. The closest thing you can get to it is a compilation of local news reports. And so you can estimate it. And it's very, very hard to make significant progress if you literally don't even have a baseline. And what you just said is true. Is like we know this sort of thing has been happening for years and decades. It's just now we can capture it on film. And so the way to make things better is to try and figure out like how we can truly see how often this is happening and not have to rely upon a passerby with a cell phone. Certainly, I think body cams are part of the solution, and that's readily executable. You just give a body cam to every officer and just have a presumption where if there's a complaint against the officer, and then you say, all right, let's look at the footage. And then if the officer is like, we don't have any footage, then like you can have a disposition being like, well, we have to assume that it was like, it went poorly for you because like you don't have the footage to like exonerate yourself.
Right.
So like you have to create a standard where it's like the footage isn't optional. It's like if you don't have the footage, then we just have to assume that you might have done something wrong. So that there are things that we can do for law enforcement. I think that there's a real need for some degree of federal trust and oversight, where you have Department of Justice and the FBI sometimes investigating these issues. It's difficult for police departments to police themselves. It's like you have people that you're working with every day, and in many cases, you're in life or death situations. Like that builds a particular kind of culture where it's going to be very hard to then turn around and say, hey, my colleague that I patrol with every single day did something wrong. So those are things we can control. It is a systemic problem. It's been going on for years. And it starts with acknowledging just the depth and severity of the problem and the pain. And it's like I talk to my Black friends and like they talk about how just dehumanizing it all feels. Like they see someone that's like could easily have been their son just have their life snuffed out in broad daylight. It's like that, and on the basis of their race. It's heartbreaking and infuriating, and so I understand that at this point people feel like they have no recourse